Something happened in that courtroom today, something they tried to stop before it could even be recorded. The judge barely finished speaking when the entire room shifted. According to witnesses, the moment Annie Guthrie was mentioned again in connection with new submissions, she suddenly lowered her head and froze in her seat. And then, silence. Not normal silence, something heavier, something uncomfortable. One courtroom observer later said, "We thought it was just another routine hearing, but the moment the new claims were read out, the energy in the room completely changed. It felt like the air got locked." And then came the line that changed everything. "These are not old allegations. These are fresh court submissions directly linked to Tommaso." That's when Annie Guthrie reportedly started shaking. And moments later, she whispered something no one expected. "Please, don't continue this." But the hearing didn't stop. Now everyone is asking the same question. What exactly was revealed in that courtroom that broke Annie Guthrie down in real time? And why has Tommaso's name suddenly been pulled into something far more serious than anyone was prepared for? Because what's coming out now doesn't look like just another case. It looks like the beginning of something much darker. To understand why today's courtroom moment shattered Annie Guthrie, you have to go back to how this entire situation with Tommaso first began, because nothing about this case was ever normal from the start. At first, there were no headlines, no breaking news alerts, no viral clips, just whispers. Whispers circulating quietly through small industry circles, saying that something off was happening behind the scenes involving Annie Guthrie and a man named Tommaso. A name that, until recently, very few people outside certain professional networks even recognized. But insiders say that changed the moment the first tension surfaced between them. According to early reports, Annie and Tommaso were once seen in the same professional environment, attending the same private events, sharing the same legal-adjacent consultations, and occasionally being spotted in what sources describe as uncomfortable but controlled interactions. Nothing public, nothing confirmed, but enough to raise questions. One anonymous source later claimed, "They weren't close, but they weren't strangers either. It was complicated, and that's what made it dangerous." At the time, nobody paid attention, until the first disagreement surfaced. It reportedly started with a private dispute, something related to documentation, trust issues, and a confidential agreement that neither side wanted exposed. But instead of staying contained, it began spreading quietly through legal channels. And that's when the tone shifted. Emails were allegedly exchanged. Meetings were suddenly canceled. Mutual contacts began distancing themselves. And within weeks, people who once said, "Everything is fine," stopped answering questions altogether. Still, the public had no idea. Because on the surface, both names, Annie Guthrie and Tommaso, continued their normal routines. Public appearances continued. Social media remained quiet. No direct accusations were made. But behind closed doors, things were escalating fast. Sources close to the situation say that tensions reached a breaking point when a confidential matter, still undisclosed, was allegedly brought into legal review. That's when attorneys became involved. And that's when the situation stopped being personal and started becoming official. Court documents were reportedly prepared. Statements were drafted. And both sides were warned to avoid public discussion. But that silence didn't last. Because once legal systems get involved, even sealed tensions have a way of leaking. By the time the first hints reached the public, it was already too late to contain speculation. Online communities started connecting dots. Old photos resurfaced. Deleted mentions were screenshot. And suddenly, the names Annie Guthrie and Tommaso were being discussed together in a way nobody expected. Still, nothing was confirmed. Until today's hearing. Insiders described the atmosphere leading up to it as tense but controlled. Reporters expected routine updates. Lawyers expected procedural arguments. Even courtroom staff believed it would be uneventful. But then the new submissions arrived. And everything changed. Because according to multiple witnesses, this wasn't just a continuation of old claims. It was an entirely new direction. Fresh allegations, new evidence, and references that allegedly connected previously unrelated events into a much larger narrative. That's when people noticed Annie's behavior shift. At first she was calm, composed, even attentive. But as more details were read aloud, sources say her posture changed. Her focus broke, and she began reacting to certain names and phrases being mentioned, especially anything linked to Tommaso. One observer described it like this. It felt like she already knew what was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way she couldn't control. And that brings us to the moment everything cracked open. Because whatever history exists between Annie Guthrie and Tommaso, It clearly runs deeper than anyone outside that courtroom understands. And today's hearing didn't just revisit that history. It reopened it. And according to those present, what was revealed next is what pushed Annie to the edge for the very first time. But nobody in that room realized yet. This was only the beginning of a much bigger storm. The turning point came the moment the court clerk began reading the new submissions out loud. At first, it sounded procedural, just another bundle of documents being entered into the record. But within seconds, the tone of the courtroom shifted so sharply that even the reporters stopped typing. Because this time the details were not vague. They were specific. Names, dates, private exchanges, and references to a sequence of events that had never been publicly mentioned before. And at the center of it all, Tommaso. According to multiple witnesses, the clerk paused for a fraction of a second before reading one particular line. That pause alone was enough to make people uneasy. Then it came. Submission includes newly verified communications allegedly involving direct coordination with Tommaso during the disputed time frame. That was the moment Annie Guthrie visibly reacted. Her hands reportedly tightened around the edge of the table. Her eyes dropped. And for the first time since the hearing began, she stopped making eye contact with anyone in the room. But what happened next is what truly changed everything. Because the court didn't just present text evidence. They introduced what was described as supporting digital material. Screenshots, message logs, and partial audio transcripts. One attorney stood up immediately, objecting, arguing that the material had not been properly reviewed. But the judge did not dismiss it outright. Instead, the judge allowed it to continue for context. And that decision opened the door. The first screenshot displayed on the courtroom screen reportedly showed a conversation thread allegedly linked to a private discussion involving Tommaso. While the full content was not publicly released, witnesses claimed the tone of the messages suggested urgency and secrecy. That's when Annie whispered something under her breath. Not loudly enough for everyone to hear clearly, but loud enough for those nearby to notice she was shaken. Then came the second twist. A printed statement was introduced, supposedly from a third-party witness who claimed they had observed interactions that contradicted previous official accounts. And this is where things escalated fast. Because according to that statement, the timeline of events previously accepted by both sides may have been incomplete or intentionally structured. That phrase alone caused murmurs in the courtroom. Intentionally structured. Meaning someone may have shaped the narrative before it ever reached court. And that implication changed everything. Now this was no longer just a dispute between Annie Guthrie and Tommaso. It was becoming a question of credibility, manipulation, and who controlled the original version of events. Then came the moment that pushed Annie to the edge. A new claim was read aloud suggesting that a private meeting, previously denied by both sides, may have actually taken place under circumstances that were never disclosed. When that line was spoken, Annie abruptly stood up. Multiple reports say she tried to interrupt the proceedings, saying, "That is not what happened. That is not true." But her voice cracked halfway through. And the courtroom fell into chaos for a brief moment as attorneys began speaking over each other, demanding clarification. The judge struck the gavel once. But the damage was already done. Because now the narrative had shifted. Publicly, this was no longer a simple misunderstanding. It was becoming a layered dispute involving conflicting accounts, hidden communications, and a timeline that suddenly didn't add up anymore. And then, just when it seemed like the courtroom couldn't get more intense, the second twist landed. A final line from the submission was read. Evidence suggests third-party involvement in communication flow between Annie Guthrie and Tommaso during critical decision points. That phrase froze the entire room. Third-party involvement. Meaning this may not have been a two-person conflict at all. Someone else may have been influencing, guiding, or even manipulating what happened behind the scenes. Annie slowly sat back down at that moment, but she wasn't the same anymore. Her composure was gone. Her expression empty. And according to witnesses, that's when she covered her face with her hand for several seconds, trying to regain control but visibly failing. Because the implication was clear now. If this third party truly existed, then everything everyone thought they understood about Annie Guthrie and Tommaso might be wrong. And the worst part? The court hadn't even finished presenting the evidence yet, which meant whatever came next could be even more damaging than anything already revealed. By the time the courtroom reconvened after a brief recess, the atmosphere had completely changed. What was once a controlled legal proceeding now felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Reporters outside were already refreshing their feeds, trying to get any detail they could. But inside the room, things were moving even faster than the outside world could process. And then came the escalation. The prosecution introduced what they described as a supplementary evidence packet. At first, it sounded routine. But the moment the documents were distributed, Annie Guthrie's expression reportedly changed instantly. Because this time, it wasn't just messages or statements. It was a reconstructed timeline. A visual breakdown of events allegedly connecting Annie Guthrie and Tommaso across multiple locations, timestamps, and private exchanges that had never been acknowledged before. And that's when the shocking reveal landed. According to the court reading, there were multiple instances where communication allegedly continued even after both parties publicly denied any ongoing contact. But the real shock wasn't just the communication. It was what those communications were allegedly about. One line, read slowly and deliberately by the clerk, said, "Records indicate coordination regarding sensitive narrative control during early stages of the dispute." The courtroom went silent again. Because narrative control is not a casual phrase. It implies influence. It implies shaping perception. It implies intent. And that's when everything spilled into chaos outside the courtroom. Within minutes, social media began erupting. Hashtags like #AnnieGuthrie, #TommasoCase, and #CourtroomLeak started trending simultaneously. Fake but widely circulated posts began appearing. If this evidence is real, this changes everything about Annie and Tommaso. How was this not public before today? And then came the celebrity reaction wave. Anonymous accounts claiming industry insiders posted statements suggesting that people close to the situation saw this coming weeks ago but were told to stay quiet. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, Annie Guthrie was seen speaking urgently to her legal team, shaking her head repeatedly as more pages were read. But the final shock of this segment came when the judge allowed one last exhibit to be entered for verification purposes. A partial transcript. Not a full conversation, but fragments. And one fragment stood out more than anything else. If this comes out, everything collapses. No explanation. No context. Just that line. And as soon as it was read, Annie reportedly covered her mouth and turned away from the bench completely. The judge called for order again, but the damage was already irreversible. Because now the question wasn't just what happened between Annie Guthrie and Tommaso. It was what exactly was so serious that someone allegedly feared total collapse if it became public. And according to court insiders, the next set of revelations was already being prepared for submission. Which means this storm was nowhere near over. The moment fragments of the courtroom testimony started leaking online, the internet didn't just react, it erupted. Within minutes, clips, screenshots, and alleged court notes began circulating across social platforms like wildfire. And even though nothing was officially confirmed, that didn't stop the speculation from turning into a full-blown digital war. Hashtags like #AnnieGuthrie, #TommasoLeak, and #CourtroomShock dominated trending charts almost instantly. And the reactions? Completely divided. One side of the internet was in disbelief. There's no way this is real, this sounds like a movie plot. If even half of this is true, this case is bigger than anyone thought. But the other side wasn't holding back either. We've been waiting for this truth to come out for months. The courtroom finally confirmed what people suspected all along. And just like that, the narrative split in two directions. Inside media circles, the reaction was even more intense. Anonymous industry accounts began posting cryptic messages like, "Some stories don't break news, they break people. Courtroom silence is louder than any headline." Meanwhile, smaller blogs started publishing analysis threads, trying to decode every leaked line from the hearing. One post claiming insider access stated, "The biggest shock isn't what was said, it's what was carefully not said in court." That single idea alone sent speculation into overdrive. Because now people weren't just questioning the evidence. They were questioning what might still be hidden. And in the middle of all this chaos, Annie Guthrie's name became the center of global attention. Fan communities started arguing violently online. Some defended her, calling the situation misrepresented and exaggerated. Others insisted that the courtroom reactions spoke for themselves. Even unrelated celebrities were dragged into the conversation, with users demanding statements, opinions, or silence as proof of alignment. But what made the situation even more explosive was the sudden silence from official sources. No clear statement. No clarification. No denial strong enough to shut down the rumors. That silence only added fuel to the fire. And then came the most controversial wave yet, Fake but viral leaked reactions claiming that people inside the legal circle were preparing for additional evidence drops. One viral post read, "This wasn't the climax. It was just the first layer. More is coming." That line alone sent panic across forums and comment sections. Because if true, it meant the courtroom story was still unfolding in real time. Back inside legal circles, reporters described tension building again as attorneys prepared for what many believed would be the final segment of submissions. Annie Guthrie was reportedly seen leaving briefly under supervision, her expression completely drained, avoiding all cameras. And that visual alone became the most shared moment of the entire day. Not the documents, not the testimony, but her reaction. Because now the world wasn't just watching a case. They were watching a breakdown unfold in real time. And as the courtroom doors closed again, everyone outside was left with one terrifying question. If this is what already got revealed, what on earth is still coming next? Just when everyone thought the courtroom had already revealed its most explosive material, the judge signaled for one final submission. And that's when the entire energy in the room shifted again. Because this time, even the legal teams looked uncertain. The document being introduced wasn't labeled like the others. No clear category. No standard heading. Just a sealed file marked as Restricted Context Addendum, Court Authorization Required. And the moment that file was opened, everything changed. A courtroom insider later described it like this. "It felt like we had stepped out of a case and into something we were never supposed to see." The clerk began reading slowly. But after just a few lines, hesitation returned. And then came the final twist. A reference was made to a previously undisclosed sequence of events allegedly involving Annie Guthrie, Tommaso, and an unidentified external party whose identity was not immediately revealed in court. But the most shocking part wasn't the involvement, it was the timing. Because according to the document, these interactions allegedly occurred during a period when both Annie and Tommaso had publicly stated they were completely disconnected. That contradiction hit the room like a shockwave. And then came the line that changed everything. Evidence suggests coordinated silence agreements were maintained during active proceedings. Silence agreements. Not just denial. Not just miscommunication. But coordinated silence. The courtroom erupted immediately. Attorneys stood up. Objections were shouted. The judge struck the gavel repeatedly. But Annie Guthrie reportedly didn't react this time. No tears. No shaking. Just silence. Witnesses say she stared straight ahead, completely frozen, as if she already knew this moment was coming. And that's what made it even more unsettling. Because if she expected it, then this wasn't just surprise evidence. This was confirmation of something deeper. Then, just as the judge prepared to pause proceedings again, another line was read, almost as an afterthought. And it sent the entire courtroom into disbelief. Further review pending regarding potential external influence on both parties' legal communication patterns. External influence. Again. But this time, it wasn't vague. It was intentional. And it implied someone else may have been shaping how both Annie Guthrie and Tommaso responded throughout the entire case. The judge immediately ordered the session sealed. But it was too late. Because outside the courtroom, reporters had already caught fragments of what was said. And within minutes, social media exploded again. But this time, the reactions weren't just shock. They were panic. Because now people realized something terrifying. This case wasn't escalating anymore. It was deepening into something far more complicated than anyone originally believed. And just as security began clearing the courtroom, Annie Guthrie was seen being escorted out through a side exit. Head down. No statements. No eye contact. But one witness claimed she was heard saying just one sentence under her breath. Then it's already out. And that's where everything stops. For now. Because according to insiders, the next hearing may reveal who that external influence actually is. And if that name comes out, nothing will be the same again.